light ricocheted into the third floor conference room in the historic Washington Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. Founded in 1799 as a shipbuilding and repair facility, today the repurposed and refurbished brick buildings are now crammed with cubicles of the Navy's acquisition teams. The massive shipbuilding cranes that anchor the cavernous spaces are now a throwback decoration for the financial, programmatic, and engineering professionals who deliver everything the Navy fleet needs to remain forward deployed. A milestone decision about to be made would make or break my $100 million program. Should we move forward and buy more of this system configuration or cancel the program? While at a senior pay grade, I was the most junior staff member in the room. Whatever the decision, I would be responsible for execution. Over the preceding 2 months, I had built the slide decks and coordinated with counterparts across the Navy enterprise to ensure this meeting would be an uneventful formality. My leadership and Admiral believed our plan was good, and the sailors could use the baseline configuration. All organizations represented and every seat filled. Then, a senior stakeholder shifted the room. He was proud of his reputation as a status quo disruptor. He took the position that the sailors didn't want the built configuration, but rather the next revision. This is like having everything ready to go for the iPhone 17 the day before launch, and the CEO stepping in and saying, forget about the 17. Don't ship anything to the customer until we ship the iPhone 18. All we had for the next configuration were high-level requirements, no design solution, no contract, and no schedule. I was angry. This was not the deal we had negotiated. I was ready to blurt out my question: why not get this into the hands of the sailors now, then make improvements when solutions are developed as per the approved plan? Our emotionally stable admiral was seething after getting blindsided. The decision was final. The program would be reorganized to meet the new technical requirements. We regrouped after the meeting, all with the same frustration, all with the same question. We all knew the question. We had asked it, just not to the person who needed to hear it. 5 years later, the program was canceled due to technical shortfalls. Time and money were spent to make the technology work, but we never got there. That day is an uncomfortable memory. I walked out of the room not saying anything. No questions, just complicity. A small, quiet surrender of professional integrity. The particular exhaustion of debriefing frustration that has nowhere useful to go. Disruptor has become a word powerful people use to preemptively justify chaos. The unasked question in that room was never really about strategy. It was, disrupt towards what? In the service of whom? That's a question about power wearing a disguise as a question about process. In organizations, unasked questions protect budgets, reputations, and leaders' egos, and programs that should have been corrected early. In faith communities, unasked questions protect doctrine and donors. In civic life, unasked questions protect presidents, institutions, and comfortable national narratives. We are watching officials dodge, deflect, and stonewall in real time and calling it governance. Every unanswered question indicts the person refusing to answer, but it also indicts the room that stops asking. We claim to be a country founded on the rule of law, justice, and accountability. The questions we refuse to ask of our own leadership are the ones we demand other countries answer. This week, I made a new friend. Kien is a Vietnamese businessman I met during jury duty. He told me that in many Asian cultures, questions are discouraged by the hierarchy of honor, class, and position. The cost is invisible but compounding. Countless opportunities missed because someone didn't step forward. It took Kien 2 years to find a mentee willing to spend 2 hours writing one email in pursuit of a significant opportunity. So, why didn't I say anything in that room? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. And the honest answer isn't simple. Hierarchy played a role, fear was definitely a factor, an onslaught of forces that I suspect most of you also know intimately. The first is the fear of losing a sense of belonging. In that conference room, speaking uninvited was a career calculation with known consequences. I was the most junior staff member in the room. The hierarchy was explicit and enforced, not by a posted rule, but by the architecture of who sat where, who spoke when, and who the room was actually organized around. My question came with a cost before I ever opened my mouth. This happens everywhere power gathers. In the boardrooms, in church elder meetings, at family dinners, certain topics have been quietly declared off limits for so long that nobody remembers who made that decision or why. The question doesn't disappear, it just learns to stay in the throat. The second force is learned helplessness. In that room, we all recognized he wouldn't be dissuaded. His mind was made up before he walked in. He seemed to revel in the disruption. The decision was less a conclusion reached through deliberation than a performance of authority. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I had already calculated, even if I ask, nothing changes, so why pay the cost? That calculation is seductive, and it's how institutions decay. When enough people, in enough rooms, decide that asking won't change anything, the person who shouldn't have power consolidates it. Not through force, through the quiet surrender of everyone who decided the question wasn't worth it. The third force is comfort and convenience. Even with the adrenaline pumping, I was tired. I had spent 2 months and late nights building those slide decks. I had coordinated across the entire acquisition Navy enterprise to make this meeting an uneventful ritual. I wanted it to be over. I wanted to walk out of that room and resume executing the plan that pre-negotiation had aligned on. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doing the right work carefully over a long period of time, and then watching someone with more positional authority undo it in an hour. The temptation is to disengage, to let it go, to tell yourself that someone else will say it, or that it'll sort itself out, or that you'll raise it through proper channels later. Later rarely comes. The fourth force is one that I find most interesting and most personal. The internalized script, the voice that says, people like you don't ask that question in rooms like this. For some of us, that script sounds like, good employees don't challenge leadership publicly. For others, it sounds like, good Christians don't question the pastor. Good citizens don't question the government. Good children don't ask why. I grew up with some version of all of these scripts running simultaneously. And what I've learned, slowly, imperfectly, is that those scripts are not wisdom. They are load-bearing walls for other people's power. They were handed to us early before we had the capacity to examine them, and we've been carrying them ever since as if they were our own convictions. My friend Kien named a version of this from his own tradition. In many Asian cultures, the hierarchy of honor, class, and position don't just discourage questions. It makes questioning feel like a moral failure, like disrespect, like ingratitude. The question that could open a door gets swallowed because the swallowing itself has been encoded as a virtue. Here is what I want to say carefully, because I don't want to be glib about this. There is a difference between a question that goes unasked and a question that gets asked in the wrong room. In that Navy Yard conference room, I didn't fail to ask the question. I asked it 45 minutes later, down the hall, with people who had already agreed with me. The question existed, it just never reached the person who needed to hear it. That is its own category of silence. Structural silencing. The institution had arranged itself so that the people most likely to ask the necessary question were the least permitted to ask it, and the people most permitted to ask it had the most to lose by doing so. I want you to hear that, because if the only thing you take away from this episode is be braver, I will have failed you. So what do we do with that? I'm not going to stand here, or in this case, sit here, rather, in my home studio, and tell you that the answer is simply to speak up. That advice is cheap and doesn't account for the real cost real people pay in real rooms every day. What I want to offer instead is something more honest. A ladder, perhaps, not a leap. Because courage, in my experience, is rarely a single dramatic moment. It's a practice. It's built in small increments, tempering, if you will, in low-stakes moments, until it becomes available to you in moments that actually matter. The first ladder rung is the questions we ask ourselves. What am I pretending not to know here? This is where it starts. Not in the conference room, not at the family dinner table, in the quiet before you walk in the moment after you walk out. What did you already know that you chose not to act on? What have you been performing ignorance about because knowing would require something of you? I knew, in the weeks leading up to that meeting, that this stakeholder was unpredictable. I had heard the stories. I had seen the pattern. I pretended not to know what that might mean for our program. That pretending cost us 5 years and a cancellation. The second ladder rung is the question we ask our in-group. What would we be asking if we weren't afraid of the answer? We asked this question down the hall after the meeting among people who had already agreed with us, and I want to be honest about what that was and wasn't. It was necessary. It was real. It was not nothing, but it wasn't sufficient. Because the in-group question, asked only among the already convinced, is a pressure valve. It releases enough frustration to make continued silence bearable. And continued silence is exactly what power needs to persist. Ask the in-group question, and then ask yourself, who else needs to hear this? The third rung is asking the question of people in power. And this is the one that costs something. And I want to give you a specific formulation that I found useful, not as a confrontation, but as an invitation to accountability. Help me understand how this decision aligns with the values we claim. Notice what the question does? No accusation or performance outrage. It creates an obligation to explain and puts the burden of coherence where it belongs, on the person making the decision, not on the person living with its consequences. I didn't ask that question in that conference room. I've asked versions of it since in other rooms with mixed results. Sometimes something opens, and sometimes the conversation closes entirely. But I have never once regretted asking it. I have regretted not asking it many times. The fourth rung is the question we ask in the public square. What questions are missing from this conversation, and who benefits from their absence? This is the meta question, the question about questions. And it matters because power doesn't only silence answers, it shapes which questions get asked in the first place. This power controls the agenda, deciding what counts as a legitimate concern and what gets dismissed as noise. When you notice a question that isn't being asked in the news, in your organization, in your community, and you give it a name, even quietly, even just to yourself, you're doing something that power would prefer you didn't do. This is an act of resistance, taking back rightful agency. I do want to say one more thing about where power actually lives. Because when we say questions to power, I don't only mean presidents and cabinet members and senior stakeholders in federal conference rooms. Power is your pastor deciding what gets preached and what gets quietly avoided. Power is your boss controlling which concerns reach leadership and which ones get managed away. Power is the influencer shaping what your community believes is worth being upset about. Power is the algorithm deciding what shows up in your feed and what disappears, not through censorship, but through the quiet engineering of your attention. The questions that need asking are everywhere. The rooms that need to hear them are closer than you think. I want to close with something you can actually do, an experiment, intentional self-tempering. For the next 7 days, I want to invite you into what I'm calling a one braver question practice. Here's how it works. Each day this week, notice one moment where you instinctively swallow a question. You don't have to ask it. You don't have to do anything with it yet. Just notice, then write it down. Give it enough dignity to exist on paper, even if it doesn't exist in the room. At the end of the week, look at what you've written. 7 swallowed questions, maybe more. And then choose one, just one, and ask it in the smallest, safest form available to you. To a friend over coffee, in an email you've been drafting for 3 weeks, in your journal, out loud, before you're ready to say it to anyone else. You don't have to change the world this week. You just have to let one question fly loose. I'll be doing the same, because here's what I know about myself. I am still learning to ask the questions I swallow. I'm still finding the conference rooms in my own life where I have arranged myself to be the most junior person present, not by rank, but by permission I have quietly granted to someone else's certainty. Hiding feels safer. I'm not arriving at this topic from above. I'm arriving at it the same way you are, as a fellow pilgrim. This is us. Still figuring out which questions are mine to ask and which ones I've been carrying for other people without realizing it. I'll leave you with a few questions to sit with. There's no rush. Let them find you rather than the other way around. Where in your life has silence quietly become agreement? Whose comfort is your unasked questions protecting? What's one question to power you are willing to ask before this moment passes? Who might stand a little taller if you did? And that's it. Thank you for being here. Thanks for asking hard questions in hard rooms. And thanks for letting me think out loud alongside you. Until next time, keep questioning.